What's up, Slut? No, error peso. Really, yeah. But for my own health purposes, maybe we have to eat and drink and be merry. Who the fuck knows? It's fucking 14th and 5786. Wednesday, April 1st, 2026. We've been doing this shit for 96 fucking days. Did you think you'd be doing it that long? Yeah, I did. Have you lost momentum? I think I could get it back. I just really like this esotericism thing, so we're gonna watch it again. And I'm somebody who I'll watch something one time and I'll get like 70% of it, and then I'll watch it again and then I'll have like 90%. I'll watch it again, I'll have like 95%, and then it's kind of I remember fuck is this shit? I remember I was in 8th grade, 7th grade, 7th grade, 7th grade, and a teacher who with whom I didn't always get along. Why? You know, it's a good question. He would have loved it, but he and I never really meshed. And I think, well, I just don't think he was that great of a teacher, to be honest with you. Really? He's smart, but I just don't know if his teaching style was that great. It's about the teacher. Anyway, one thing that I did learn from him. So imagine there's a wall. I remember there's this wall with this picture of the Near East, like the Levant, like Israel. We didn't have any fucking maps in the school except that one, really. Maybe one other. Anyway, so there's a picture of the Levant, and he said, if you, let's say there's like 10 feet, you have that by 5, you'll be 5 feet away. Have that again, 2.5 feet. Have that again, you'll have 1.25 feet. Have that again, you'll have 0.625 feet. Yeah. And you keep going and closer, but you'll never hit the other wall. Anyway, I kind of feel like that's the same with a documentary or anything. Like, you can keep learning it and you can keep getting closer and closer to the wall, but you'll never get there 100%. I don't know. Maybe you can, but uh, there's anything really learnable. Shut the fuck up. I'm not giving a shit about those things right now. So let's do with you, big dog. What do we do for Pesach? Dog, do whatever the fuck you want. Traditionally, we make our homes look like fucking spacecraft, like literally like the inside of a UFO. They call it aluminum foil, but it's not. Aluminum's too expensive. Or no, pardon me. They call it tin foil, but tin foil is too expensive. It's aluminum foil. Anyway, aluminum's not even that great for you. But it's unreal what happens. It is the most obsessive compulsive thing in Judaism is our operations for Pesach. I remember I was in Chabad many years ago, and I would eat Shabbat at other people's homes at this time many times. So like I didn't have challah in the house, and I didn't eat bread for any other reason other than for religious reasons. And the rabbi said, "Have you searched your home for chametz?" And I'm like, "I don't have chametz." He's like, "How don't you have chametz?" I'm like, "I don't eat at home." And it's like nothing. I'm like, and I really didn't. I was living in a hotel, and I just you never ate there. No, I might have like cheese, something, but nothing with hummus. And I remember him being like, he was like stumped, like he'd never met anybody who didn't have hummus in their home. And I don't. How about now? Like no one even knows what the fuck that is. It's leavened bread, dog. Fuck that shit. Anyway, have your shmur matzah. I got everything I need. What are your thoughts on matzah? I fucking love matzah. Israel, if you never, you gotta listen to me on some stuff because I have the best fucking ideas for a lot of things. But some recipes that I have, they're all so simple. But this is amazing. Like you'll go to a restaurant where they have like perhaps like chips and salsa. Maybe it's a kosher Mexican restaurant. Or they'll have like some kind of starter. In Israel, the starter needs to be this. It is amazing. It's matzah with extra salt in Trader Joe's OU kosher marinara sauce. It is. You could just sit there and dip this shit like chips and salsa. It's through chips and salsa. It's like Jewish chips and salsa. It's like Israeli chips and salsa, and it is so good. People always complain about matzah. I could eat matzah at any time. Like, oh, it's so bland. Blah, 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 blah. It's like, it's fine. It's like, I think it's good. I'm like the one Jew who really fucking likes matzah. I'm sure I know there are others of us, but like, I really like matzah. And in terms of matzo ball soup, nidalek, and all that, we don't put enough matzo balls in our fucking matzo ball soup. There's like one. It's like, duh. This should be nidalek with a little broth. That's how I want it. Really, yeah. Noodles, fucking yeah, man. They could call me Noodles. Like in Once Upon a Time in America, that kid's named Noodles, and I was when I eat, I think that I eat noodles so much. Why do you like noodles? I've always liked noodles, and my grandparents I always liked noodles. My grandmother would make chicken paprikash, which is like traditional Hungarian, but it's like an Ashkenazi dish. I've had it on Shabbat. It's like, what is it? I don't know all the ingredients, but it's like chicken, and there's like this broth that looks like vomit. It's got paprika in it, and there's some other shit in it, and there'd be like a bed of noodles with chicken paprikash, and I fucking love that. And a friend of mine made it on Shabbat a few years ago, and it tasted just like my grandmother's, and it was like I hadn't had it in many many years. That's like the one dish that I hadn't had that it like awakened something in me. Um, there are smells. Smell is the sense that's most tied to memory, but this like that's a thing, but like the taste is a thing. And what is it? Chicken paprikash. It's like you can use like a crock pot or like a slow cooker or something like a hot plate. It's just I don't know. It's like there aren't many Hungarian dishes that I like, but uh, and my grandfather's Hungarian, my grandmother was not, but she'd make it because my grandfather liked it, and she learned how to make it. And the one thing I didn't like about it is I don't like bones. I wish there was some kind of like machine that could debone a fish or a chicken or whatever, but to the point where it could be like scientifically, like the quality control on it would be like Six Sigma, like 0.00001% chance of any error. Like people die of choking on chicken bones far too often in the world. And have you ever didn't die, but have you ever choked on a chicken bone? I've choked on stuff. One time when it was the worst of all. No, fortunately. Um, not choking. I had this. I've been hospitalized a lot in my life. Even though I'm a very like healthy person, I consider my just for weird reasons. This one I had neutropenia, which is low blood cell count, which people associate with AIDS, but I didn't have AIDS really yet, or HIV or any of that stuff. What happened? Um, let's just say I was taking a supplement to lose weight, and it basically killed off all of white blood cells. And I did this twice, not realizing and it could contribute to other issues that I have, including cataracts and stuff. But it's like it's a legal thing. It's like I don't want to get into it, but anyway, I was in a hospital and my throat was like so swelled up, but I but the doctors and nurses they didn't know what was wrong with me. Um, they did not know how hard it was for me to swallow. It was like at the point where I could not swallow. My throat was so swelled. Really, yeah. I don't want to get too much into it right now, but I don't know. I'm just talking. Anything else about Pesach? What's your favorite Pesach? I've had a few of them. I mean, I remember when I joined New Shul like a decade ago or so, and they asked me in front of like an entire room of people what my favorite Pesach was. To that point, I remember saying it was one when I was like maybe in fifth. I don't know. I just remember really getting into Pesach and maybe about age 13 or so. Maybe not that old. Probably a little younger. Yeah, not 13 yet. But so I was not yet bar mitzvah, but it just was it. And then um we do this thing where we would do like different impressions of uh, I think it was in Who Knows One. So Echad Meyodea, and I did the 9 months of pregnancy, and I had like in front of that I did not know had to reenact giving birth, and I did my best. Anyway, so what is it? 13 attributes of God, 12 tribes of Israel, 11 stars in Joseph's dreams, 10 the 10 pronouncements, 9 months of pregnancy, 8 the days until the Brit Milah, 7 the days of the week, 6 the orders of the Mishnah, 5 the books of the Torah, 4 the matriarchs Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, 3 the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 2 the tablets of the covenant. Anyway, that was an interesting one. I always like Coke during Pesach. It's better. What are your feelings on kidney oat? It's a traditional Ashkenazi take, but it's very. I'm like, huh? Obsessive compulsive. Really, yeah. There's a lot within religion that's obsessive compulsive and superstitious. Anyway, okay, are you gonna watch your thing? No, we gotta do the thing. 3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. Chava 3631, 130. Seth, son of Adam, was born. No one really knows for sure. Eluve Divrei Elohim, but this is the Missouri we live by. Really? Yeah.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism, and from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism.
My quote looks like Rodney Day's skinny version.
Few weeks, or you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism and Hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon, perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. So, first and foremost, I just really want to thank everyone for taking the time to join me on this journey through Jewish mysticism. This is some of the weirdest stuff. I mean, it's sort of like ancient science fiction. And so I really appreciate folks taking the time to join me for some of this vast, really, really amazing and beautiful, very controversial literature. So that said, again, also just really stoked that some of the really awesome people, it's like scholars like Ashley Four. It's really, thank you so much. Ashley is an amazing scholar of Marxism who I really admire a lot. So having folks in the room that are so smart and just really take the time to listen to me, I guess, I'm just really humbled by that. So thank you all for coming along with me on this journey entering the garden. As I mentioned in the email, the term garden here is from pardes, right, which is this big word in Jewish mysticism that often mystics are described as going down into a garden. In Jewish mysticism, we don't typically go up, which is a little unusual, right? We typically think of mysticism as going up towards God or whatever that is up there, but typically in Jewish mysticism, we descend into things. And so the sort of lobby of the world of the mystical is this pardes, this garden. And what's really amazing is that we all get to enter this garden together. And I will say that in traditional Jewish lore, especially found in the Talmud and through the Middle Ages, this is considered to be in the very famous story, as you may know, in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Chagiga. 4 people went down into the garden, and only one came out alive, basically, right? So one became a heretic, one became insane, one died, and only one, Rabbi Akiva, emerged. And so we'll talk about that really famous story here in just a couple of weeks. So Jewish mysticism is, on the one hand, I think, an incredibly intriguing domain of study, but it also has always had an undercurrent of danger. And we'll see some of that undercurrent of danger as we get into it as well. what kind of class is this going to be? How are we going to approach this material? Well, I wear my methodology on my sleeve. I am a historical materialist. When I approach this material, I try to approach it from a historically minded, material understanding of history. And what that means is I try to locate historical ideas and persons and other kinds of concepts which they emerge. I try to do some general mystical ideas about what this stuff means. You have to do that on your own time because I don't have the mental capacity to tell you what half this stuff means. I can tell you what got written down, by whom and why, and maybe something about the world in which it got produced. But what it might mean for your spirituality, for instance, is something that might just be, frankly, completely beyond me. But what we'll be looking at through the course of this class is a kind of more of the major concepts, the major texture and personalities that go into Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. One of the things I really hope that you get out of this class as we work through it is, for me, Kabbalah has always been incredibly intimidating. The books of the Kabbalah are very intimidating. And part of what I hope to do is give you confidence and give you enough context that if you wanted to dive deeper into Kabbalistic books, you could do that. Right? So Yohar or the Sefer Yetzirah or other major historical Jewish mystic texts, and that you could feel confident that you could dive into them. Now, sink or swim, that's probably up to you, but you can at least feel the confidence to make the dive. So what I'm not going to do, and what my aim isn't in this class, is I can't make you a Kabbalist. Right? I'm not a Kabbalist. I don't identify as a Kabbalist. And so I can do a Kabbalist. I think it takes a Kabbalist to make a Kabbalist. I think it works like that. Like it takes a rabbi to make a rabbi. I think it takes a Kabbalist to make a Kabbalist. And I ain't no rabbi, and I ain't no Kabbalist. So I don't have the ability to make you a Kabbalist. Now, that's not to say that some of these ideas might very well prove to be incredibly positive in your spiritual life and your spiritual development. If that's the case, that's it. But I don't want anyone to have the idea that what I'm going to be teaching is how to do Jewish mysticism. Because I don't know how to do Jewish mysticism, or if I did, I would be doing that in a different class, maybe. So we're going to be studying it again from a historical, academic perspective, as opposed from studying it as trying to be mystics. So we're not going to be doing much in the way of meditating on Hebrew letters to measure the body of God. Measure the body of God. God has really long fingers, which are really creepy. So we'll get to that this kind of mysticism later. So what do I mean by mysticism? This is a word that is really difficult to pin down. It's one of these words like religion or magic, where scholars and academics have no real consensus about what this word means. So I'm just going to throw out a really stipulative definition of what I'm going to mean by mystical in this class. And you're certainly going to hear the fact that I come from a philosophical background. And so coming from a philosophical background, I think about mysticism largely in a philosophic lens. And what I mean by mystical is a non-rational mode in which one learns about fundamental reality, right? So, and in addition to that, right, it's also the traditions that accrue, right, because of those kinds of experiences. Now, and by the way, the word tradition, right, I'm kind of punning on it in Hebrew, right? The word Kabbalah actually means received, and it has a sense of tradition, right? So I'm kind of punning a little bit on what this word mysticism. When I say non-rational, what here is not irrational, right? It's not like mystics can just say whatever they want. They can't do that. They're inside of traditions, they're inside of cultural contexts, they're inside of religious settings. And so what they say, as daring as it might be, is always situated and only makes sense within a specific context. So it's not just irrational. They're not just saying random crazy things. Right? Sometimes mystics are thought as being somehow crazy or something like that. And that's not the case. In fact, many mystics enigmatic in how they go about doing their mysticism. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, the great German Christian mystic. But when I say non-rational, what I do mean here is that they're not going to be giving us arguments. The mystic's not going to tell you A, then B, then C, therefore you should deduce D. And they're not going to be saying something like, I did an experiment, and from my experiment, my induction is a 75% certainty that blah, 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 blah. They're not doing any of that. They're having visions, they're having experiences, and they're reporting back on content of those experiences or the way that those experiences have transformed them personally. So when I say non-rational, I want you to hear neither irrational nor rational. Non-rational, between, something in between. I should also say just a little bit out of the gate about the distinction here to be made between Jewish mysticism more generally and Kabbalah more specifically. We now, in the sort of sloppy vernacular that we use the term Kabbalah to describe all of Jewish mysticism. That's a bit of a mistake. The Kabbalah, right, is a very specific kind of Jewish mysticism that began to emerge in the 13th century. Now, 13th century of the Common Era, mostly in southern France and Spain. So we're going to get to the Kabbalah, and obviously we're going to spend a lot of time on Kabbalah, but we got to get there. And the Kabbalah wasn't cut out of whole cloth. It didn't just emerge out of nothing. And so many of the complex ideas that you may have heard of in Kabbalah, like Tikkun Olam, which is a Kabbalistic idea, the reparation of the world, or the idea of Tzimtzum, the contraction into which God sort of shrinks God's self to project the universe or the cosmos, those ideas don't come out of whole cloth, and we're going to have to do a little bit of work to get there, but get there we will. So think about Kabbalah as a specific type of Jewish mysticism, and there are other Jewish mysticisms that also existed prior to the Kabbalah. Right? So there are other forms of Jewish mysticism that existed prior, although many of those prior forms of mysticism were absorbed into Kabbalah. So this is part of the reason why it gets a bit confusing. So suffice to say, Israelite or Jewish mysticism extends probably back toward history. What I mean by history, of course, is just the history of writing. When the ancient Israelites began to write things down. And as we'll see in a moment, some of the earliest texts that have been recovered in Israelite literature are, interestingly enough, both composed by women and also both composed by mystic women. So we'll get to those in just a minute. But I think this is a weird thing that, for whatever reason, doesn't get enough press, that some of the earliest Israelite literature is by women mystics. So press misogyny, but right, it's true. If you guys what you're seeing on the screen here on the left-hand side, this is an image of an amulet recovered from a burial site in Jerusalem called Ketef Hinnom. And what you're looking at is the earliest recovered archaeological section of the Hebrew Bible. So if you've ever wondered what the earliest text of the Hebrew Bible looks like, it's this. These are tiny little silver amulets that were recovered from a tomb. And for the folks here that read a little bit of Hebrew, you probably can see a version of the priestly benediction. So the earliest fraction, the earliest text we have of the Torah is actually an amulet, a magical device put into a tomb, very likely to protect the dead, perhaps from malevolent supernatural forces. So in many ways, we might even see the appearance of the Torah in history is a supernatural, mystical appearance. It's an amulet. It's an amulet there to protect the dead, probably. If you've ever been to the Israel Museum, you may have seen this, and it's actually on both sides, and it's tiny. The little amulet's probably about that big, and the Hebrew letters here, as you can see, they are very old papers. The earliest case in which we can talk about an Israelite form of mysticism has to do with two different concepts. One concept is theophany, which means God appearing. We'll talk about it more in just a moment. And the other, of course, I'm sure many folks know, is prophecy, which is a case in which God, the Israelite God, is said to speak to people And those people that Yahweh speaks to, in turn, speak on the behalf of Yahweh. And in fact, that's where the word prophecy comes from. The word prophet just means to speak for in ancient Greek. So core to ancient Israelite religion, like many ancient religions, was the idea that their God, Yahweh, spoke to people, communicated to people. Now, typically, when gods speak to people, that is non-rational, right? That's not rational. It's not rational, right? It's not like you can make a logical, deductive argument that God's speaking to you. And yet, prophets are often taken seriously and sometimes killed in history. But it's very clear from ancient Israelite society and the larger ancient Near East society that prophecy was a widely important social vocation. So Yahweh talked to people, and the people said what Yahweh told them. And this is really important in two distinct ways. One way that's really important is that Yahweh does something very interesting with the ancient Israelites that we don't really see attested in many other ancient Near East cultures. And that is Yahweh establishes a vassal contract nation. A vassal contract is just what it sounds like. A vassal contract where a lesser power agrees to be ruled over by a stronger power, basically for protection. This is, if you want to think about this in terms of like, I don't know, mafia, it's like paying protection money, right? The local mob boss comes down and says, you know, you can get hurt out here. You might want to protect you. Well, Yahweh comes along and says, it's dangerous out there, you Israelites. Maybe you should worship me alone, and I'll protect you, right? And so, in many ways, the Torah is actually structured a lot like a vassal contract. In fact, if you read ancient Near East vassal contracts written in the Akkadian language, it's very clear that the writer of the Torah, these certain sections of the Torah, are emulating that contract language. They're diplomats. Diplomats had to be literate. One of the things diplomats would have known, Israel was almost always a vassal state for the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Syrians. Vassal contracts would have been part of their life, and making a vassal contract with their God would have made a lot of sense. This is also revolutionary because you're making a vassal contract with a God and not another country. You're subservient fundamentally to some other being and not the king of Babylon or whatever. Now, this doesn't go well for the ancient Israelites, but it does establish what we call the Deuteronomic theology. And this is just a complicated way of saying, if you have a contract, contracts are always involved you getting things out of the deal. Well, the Israelites vowed that they would serve only one God. Yahweh vows that if they do that, they will get the land, right? They will have the land, and a land flowing with milk and honey and all the rest, right? And the idea is they keep their side of the deal, the Israelites, then Yahweh will keep their side of the deal and protect them. Now, if you know anything about Jewish history, that relationship was rocky, let's call it. It just didn't happen for a lot of reasons. There are lots of things that broke in that process. Further, right, in addition to this whole vassal contract business between Yahweh and the Israelites, it also seems like there was a tradition within the Israelite community where Yahweh spoke to individual people. Those people typically called Navi, right, prophets, Naviim. These prophets would receive the message from Yahweh and then go communicate it to the Israelite community. It was always negative. You never invite a prophet to a party. It will ruin any party you invite them to because they'll mostly spend all their time condemning everything you have your whole life. So prophets are the joy kill of all times. So prophets, as we know from ancient Israelite and other ancient Near East literature, are widely attested. Prophet was a job, right? You could be an independent freelance prophet. You could be a prophet. We'll talk. You're seeing on the screen here on the right-hand side is actually a divinatory device. I don't know if you can recognize what organ that is, but that is a liver. That is a liver. And what you see here is the liver is divided into certain sections, and there is cuneiform script on that liver. This is from the old Babylonian period. And what you would do, if you wanted to figure out the that you kill an animal, typically a sheep. You would take out their liver, obviously, and you would inspect it. And what this is a Babylonian liver inspection guide. And so if there are blemishes or deformities or other kinds of markings on the liver, livers are typically very smooth organs. If you've ever seen a liver, they're typically very smooth, but they have markings and things on them. And what happens is that you would locate the markings, and you can see here there's a guide in Old Akkadian. It would tell you what the markings meant. So this might mean that bad things are going to happen, the king's going to die, whatever. And so there have been, by the way, hundreds of these recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, and divination was widely attested here. That we separate divination and prophecy when it comes to talking about the ancient world, because the vast majority of prophets, contrary to what idea might come to your mind about what a prophet is, very few prophets predicted the future. That was a different job. Those were diviners. Diviners predicted the future. Prophets communicated via the God. The God would tell the prophet stuff, and then they people. That's a different job. Now, sometimes prophets did predict the future. In fact, in the Hebrew Bible, there's only a couple of occasions where prophets attempt to predict the future, and they're almost always wrong. One time Ezekiel attempts to predict the future, and he's wrong, and he has to go back later and be like, well, I meant that metaphorically or something. And so very few prophets predict the future. In the ancient world, that is a different job. We now think of prophets as predicting the future, but that's a modern idea, much more than an ancient Israelite idea or ancient Near Eastern idea. So let's talk about theophany first, right? So theophany just means God appearing. It just means that God appears to people. Right? This was an idea in ancient. It's appearing to you currently on the screen. I don't know how many people have ever seen an image on the left. This is very likely an early depiction of the Israelite God Yahweh. We think that is Yahweh for a couple of reasons. One, it says Yahu there in Hebrew, which was an abbreviation of Yahweh's name, and this was of the as part of the satrap of Yehud during the Persian period. And also we have a throned, winged throne chariot that this is being sitting in, and that image is very tightly associated with Yahweh in the book of Ezekiel. You're probably looking at a depiction of Yahweh. That's probably the Israelite God. We're fairly confident that all ancient Judahites conceived of how their God looked. I don't know, how many people have seen this image before? Show of hands or things like this. Some folks have seen it. I think it's very interesting that most folks, when they see an image like this, they think of the idea that Yahweh is not allowed. But clearly here on the coinage is Yahweh. I also like that Yahweh has a six-pack. I really appreciate that. Yahweh does not skip ab day. So God appearing, right? God appearing is a relatively common motif in ancient religions. In fact, many ancient religious rituals were meant to compel the God to appear. This would be in temples and other kinds of, you would do rituals to make the God appear to you. So what's interesting about the Israelite theophany, God appearing, is that sometimes the Israelite writers like to depict their image of Yahweh as a kind of divine monarch, sort of like a king sitting on a throne. Very common image. And if you have the chance to read this section in Isaiah, the theophany of Isaiah, that's exactly what you get, is a kind of divine leader sitting on a throne. However, what's also important is that the ancient Israelites had developed at some point an allergy to depicting their God. The God of their God is incorporeal and is invisible. And in other texts, most famously the text of the theophany to Moses, Yahweh actually tells Moses that if you see me, you'll die. You cannot see me face to face. Although later in the book of Deuteronomy it does say you saw me face to face. whatever. The Bible has all kinds of editorial problems. We do see images where God appears to the Israelites, always occluded somehow. One of the main depictions in the book of Exodus is God is hidden in the Arafel, which means something like the gloom or the darkness. And there's all kinds of light and lightning all around where the God is, but the God itself is actually hidden somehow in the darkness. So God is also hidden at the same time. So the Israelites are always trying to navigate. On one hand, they want to claim our God appeared to us on Mount Sinai and gave us a law. And this is our contract. We have a contract with God, and that's what makes us special, a chosen people. And on the other hand, they're like, yeah, our God's invisible. You can't see our God. Our God doesn't have a body, doesn't live in a place. God's a God who also appears quasi-invisible as well. The main accounts that we have of theophanies in the Hebrew Bible are the main three, right, or four actually. We have the theophany to Abraham, or Abram at that time, right? His name hadn't been changed yet. Where God appears to Abram and says, hey, you need to follow me and do what I said, right? Move out of Ur of Canaan, move to Canaan and set up shop there in that instance. The other three theophanies that are important are the Moses theophany, that is to say, one in which God appears to Moses, both in the burning bush. So notice again, God is there and not there at the same time. The voice comes out of the bush, but it's not like there's a person there that Moses sees. Again, there's a relationship to God that they want to keep separate, unlike perhaps other nearby religions. The two most important theophanies in Israelite literature are the ones to the prophet Isaiah and the one to the prophet Ezekiel. And I don't know if you had the chance to read the theophanies to Isaiah and Ezekiel. They're very strange, especially the Ezekiel one. It's notoriously weird. But the one thing that we do with theophanies is that in both cases, they are terrifying. You do not want Yahweh showing up for you, right? This being is not your friend. This being is not your buddy. It's not your dream partner. This being is a terrifying being that when they do show up, the people that seem to see this being, I say quaking in their boots. The text says they are quaking, like literally, they are shaking in terror. And this is one of the things that we see in Israelite literature, beginning in the Hebrew Bible, but extending into other mystical literature, is that the experience of the divine is terrifying. We have the word awesome, right? But notice how we say all full of all, the word gets negative. All full is bad, but all some is good. Some all is okay. It's like a rainbow. A lot of all is bad. It's all full. But when God appears to you and Yahweh appears to the Israelite prophets, it is a terrifying experience. We even have the records of their bodies physically shaking, sweating. They lose the ability to speak, things like that. What we think is that the instances of Ezekiel and Isaiah may have been part of what we might shamanism. Now, I don't use the word shamanism in a willy-nilly way. I think that shamanism, as you may know, was a religious practitioner, an ecstatic expert, primarily found in Siberia. And this idea that shamanism has been taken out of this context and applied more generally, I'm a bit skeptical of that process. I don't like using that in a kind of a rough and ready way. But what we see is that the ecstatic expert, or the shaman, is able to withstand a visitation from Yahweh. And from that visitation, they're able to extract certain kinds of information about what needs to be done. And so, in much of the same way that traditional shamans will often travel to the spirit world in order to cure people, something happening with some forms of prophecy where the shamans are being visited by Yahweh, and Yahweh is basically telling them how to fix their country. Right? Most of what goes on in prophecy is criticism of society in a general way, And the idea is by criticizing society along religious and social terms, then the Israelites can restore their relationship with Yahweh, and therefore Yahweh will continue to protect them and allow for the land. So the prophets don't cure individual people. You can think about them much more like shamans, but they're shamans for the entire community. So again, this is where using some of these terms can be a little bit misleading and a little bit unclear, but I think that the term does track, at least in a general way. We think that the experiences of the prophets Isaiah and the prophets Ezekiel, the literary record that we have in the Hebrew Bible, probably actually experience. Which is just to say, the persons of Ezekiel and Isaiah probably did experience some kind of mystical event. And they recorded that event, and it is that recording of it is found in the Hebrew Bible. Now, Ezekiel is especially interesting in this regard because if you've read other texts of Ezekiel, you'll know that he is really unusual as a person. He seems to do really extreme things, like lie in the street naked at a time. So he may have been suffering from some kind of underlying mental health condition, right? We don't know. I mean, again, it's not for me to pathologize Ezekiel or to diagnose him because I have the ability to do neither. But from the record, it seems like Ezekiel may have had some other kinds of mental health concerns, we would say now, which is also interesting because it shows that what is insanity in one culture, prophecy in another, right? That a shaman functioning in one culture, right, is completely normal. But you take them out of that and put them into capitalism where they can't work, and now they're insane, they're crazy. And so it's just interesting to see how what counts as insanity can really change from culture to culture. Ezekiel is clearly a respected member of society, whereas I think now he might be institutional. So again, it's interesting how these things can shift enormously through time. It's also worth noting here that Ezekiel and Isaiah, the theophanies of Ezekiel and Isaiah, which the Isaiah one is also very terrifying, right? God appears to Isaiah, and basically Isaiah says, "I'm going to die." And he says, "I'm finished." And he doesn't die, and then he's basically anointed by God to tell the message of Yahweh. What's really important about both of these visions is that they will become the foundations for an entire school of Jewish mysticism called Merkava literature, or chariot literature. This form of Jewish mysticism, which we'll get to not next time, but the time after that, this was the Jewish mysticism for 800 years. So if you want to think about the Kabbalah as existing now for about 800 years, Merkava mysticism was the dominant form of Jewish mysticism for the 800 years prior to that. So this chariot mysticism, and again, when I say chariot mysticism, you should always keep in mind, right? This is how Yahweh is depicted, as literally riding on a kind of winged chariot. Unsurprisingly, this form of mysticism is going to be very important. Just as a preview, Merkava mysticism is a form of mysticism in which the rabbinical elite would descend into the palaces of Yahweh, and they would meet with various angels, and they would show angels these various passwords, and eventually they would be able to climb through the various heavens. And again, even I did it up, right? They're not going up. In the mystical your day go down the chariot, and they eventually are given a glimpse of the throne of God. Sometimes they're allowed to see the body of God, which I know that Jews are not supposed to believe that God has a body. They did. They were allowed to measure the body of God. We'll look at that literature. And in some cases, they were even allowed to sit on the throne of God and be transformed into angels. So if you ever want to be transformed into an angel, all you have to do is bypass the scary angels and sit on the throne of God. No big one. No big. So that's a very cool form of mysticism, and we will get to it in a couple of weeks. So again, Merkava mysticism, not Kabbalah. Different kind of Jewish mysticism, but anchored in the theophany of Ezekiel, Isaiah. So as I mentioned earlier, ancient Near East prophecy is very well attested. The only major exception is Egypt. Egypt is the outlier. For whatever reason, there's not much in the way of Egyptian prophetic literature. Now, there's a lot of debates about why that is. We do have a prophetic document called the Prophecy of Nefertiti that does exist from the ancient Egyptian world, but it seems like the ancient Egyptians, for a host of reasons, and I'm happy to talk more about that later if folks are interested, for whatever reason, institutional prophecy just didn't exist. It probably had to do with the fact that Egyptian religion was very highly centralized in the temple structure, and therefore the gods just didn't interact with human beings in the same way they did in the wider Near East. But the ancient Egyptians just don't have much in the way of prophecy. We have a lot of ancient Egyptian religious literature, just not prophetic literature. I will say that outside of ancient Israel, the best adaptation of prophecy in the ancient Near East world more generally is from the Neo-Assyrian period. Now, this may be a little deceptive because it just so happens that the Assyrian Empire was destroyed and they managed to burn down the main library of Benefal. And when they burned that library down, the entire library was preserved. We have basically an entire ancient Neo-Assyrian library. It's like the Library of Ancient Alexandria, but over in Iraq. It has tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets that are in great shape because unlike burning libraries down now, right? Because the books tend to burn, that's bad. Burn down an ancient cuneiform library, right? Those texts are all preserved on clay tablets. And burning clay tablets makes them more likely to survive. So, thank God they burned it down, right? Because had they not burned it down, it probably wouldn't have survived. So, we have the entire library of Ashurbanipal. It's in the British Library because they're great at stealing things. And so, what we have is an enormous amount of literature from this time, include prophetic literature. In the ancient Assyrian context, what they would do is an individual prophetic utterance requested by a leader, typically the king. Those utterances would be written down, and then a digest of those ecstatic utterances would be collected together on large clay tablets, and then those clay tablets would be stored in the library of Ashurbanipal. So we have individual utterances stored together on bigger tablets and then archived. That same thing happened in ancient Israelite context too. Many of the documents we have, for instance, the book of Isaiah, is not written by one person. Isaiah is at least written by 3 people, right? At 3 different times with 3 different agendas. All of the various Isaiah texts got edited together into one digest, and that Isaiah prophecy became the book that we now know of as Isaiah. So the exact same literary and material culture in ancient is also attested in ancient Israel, which we shouldn't be surprised about because ancient Israel isn't special. Now, I know that some of us were raised with this chosen people stuff, but the ancient Israelites were an ancient Near Eastern people. And they did what other ancient Near Eastern people did. Sorry, not sorry. So we know a lot about ancient prophecy. We'll get to Israelite prophecy in just a minute. We know a little bit about their prophetic techniques. We know, for instance, that they engaged in dancing. Dancing was one of the mechanisms by which both Israelite and Neo-Assyrian prophets managed to work themselves into a kind of ecstatic state. We don't know what the dancing like. Maybe it was it seemed to get them into the Lindy Hop. It got them into an ecstatic state, and in those ecstatic states, they would shout what the god had to tell them, and a scribe would write those ecstatic utterances down. They also engaged self-laceration. So, as you may or may not know, self-harm is a pretty common motif in many mystical practices, most famously, for instance, among the Maya people. The Maya would they would pierce their tongue or their genitals, and they would pull string with barbs on it through their tongue or genitals in order to make themselves in a great deal of pain. That blood would be gathered into a pot, and then the paper with the blood soaked would burn, and in the burning smoke, Maya kings would see visions. It's a very common thing that happens in Mid-Vedic cultures. The self-harm also occurred in ancient something like flagellation, probably, so the whipping themselves in order to use perhaps the endorphins or the serotonin release to get them into ecstatic states. Although there's some medical debate about whether blood loss would have been helpful in getting you into an ecstatic state. I intend to find out. So at any rate, self-harm was also part of this. Also notice that in the ancient Israelite law, there are several prohibitions on self-harm, especially in terms of religious self-harm, specifically things like tattooing and harming yourself on the occasion of the dead. So it seems like the Israelites knew about these practices, and for things about you're not allowed to get tattoos if you're Jewish or whatever, it actually comes from those kinds of laws. Although also there's a persistent myth that if you have tattoos, you can't be buried in a Jewish graveyard. That's nonsense. I don't know where these weird things get started, but that's a thing people say, and they're wrong. We also know, interestingly enough, that ancient Near Eastern prophets could be both women and men. We have attestations of both women and men prophets. And we also, what's I think really important that doesn't get talked about enough, is that we have a third gender that is specifically connected to ancient Near Eastern prophecy. Specifically the goddess Ishtar, who you may know from the name Esther. The name Esther is just the version of the name Ishtar. We know that Ishtar could convert gender from typically male gender, mander, to another third gender called Asinu. And these Asinu prophets would have their gender converted by Ishtar, and they could be converted and converted back on the command of the goddess. And while you were converted to this Asinu gender, this third gender, you would be serving the goddess here probably in a sex working job in the temple precincts. And so we have interesting is that the only attestation of a certain third gender with its own kind of grammar. The grammar here actually means womb person, but womb pursulent gender in Akkadian. So clearly womb is associated with female people, whereas the word here is asinu. They're clearly making it a gender bending category. And you can have your gender, typically men. I don't know if there's any cases of women being assigned to be asinu, but men prophets could be shifted to the asinu gender. So if you're curious about that, FYI, there's a great study of that by the SBL called Prophets Male and Female. I can chat later. That is the most extensive study of the and ancient Near East prophecy. One Canaanite non-Israelite prophet, and that is Balaam, son of Beor. You know, from the Torah. He's also attested in another place. He's attested in a shrine that the wall is plastered, and he's mentioned on the plaster of the wall. And he's mentioned in a non-Israelite language, I think it's Moabite. And so he must have existed and been quite famous. In fact, he's the only prophet from the ancient attested outside of the Bible. So he was famous enough that the Bible had to include him, and he was so famous that he was also attested outside of the Bible as well. However, no non-Israelite Canaanite prophetic texts survive. If they existed, which they very well did, they very well likely did, they didn't survive. The reason for that might be is they were written down on papyrus and simply did the eventual supremacy of the Israelites in Gaullism. It could just be that they haven't been discovered yet. But we do not have records of prophets, non-Israelite prophets, leaving behind a literary record. Unlike, I should mention this text that is on the screen here, this is probably one of the most important ancient Near Eastern religious texts. This is called the Descent of Ishtar. This is a tale where Ishtar descends into the underworld. If you've never read it before, I highly encourage you to take a look at it. It is a description of Ishtar going into the underworld and ultimately becoming trapped there and having to escape. And it's a really interesting text about Ishtar's journey to the underworld. Many religions have journey to the underworld motifs. Christianity, for instance, has a pretty famous journey to the underworld. Orpheus and the Greek legends. So this journey to the underworld business is a pretty typical religious literature. And the journey to Ishtar is especially really wonderful to read. Again, prophetic literature and literature world in which women are central focus, like in Israelite mythology, where it's all dudes all the time. What we have in Israelite prophecy is a very state of affairs, very complicated state of affairs. Prophecy was we know of hundreds of prophets from the ancient Israelite world. And you put that into a sort of material cultural analysis, what that means is that Yahweh was perceived as basically being in constant contact with people. That is to say, you could kind of go down the street and your village, Yahweh, you could probably pay at Yahweh.com or gov. And so prophecy was widely attested. So first thing that we know is that prophets occurred in both genders. We have both women and men prophets. And in fact, the oldest literature attested in the Hebrew Bible are both prophetic pieces of literature from women, specifically attributed to Devorah and Miriam. As you may know, the Song of the Sea and the Song of Devorah, found in the book of Judges, are probably the oldest pieces of the Hebrew Bible. They are so old that there's no definite article yet in Hebrew, right? They are very old, probably dating back to the Bronze Age. And what we think is that at this period, both of these literature, the Sea and the Song of Devorah, are what we call warband prophecy. Warband prophecy was a very common form of prophecy all throughout the world, in which a prophet had contact with their God, and they would give advice specifically about military matters. And usually what would happen is you would consult the prophet about military matters, and then after you won, assuming you did, the prophet would sing your praises as having won on behalf of the God. And that's exactly what we have in the Song of Devorah and in the Song of Miriam. The Song of Devorah probably is a very early, probably Bronze Age or very early Iron Age account of a tribal conflict in which one group of people killed the other, right? This is also the story of a tent spiked through a dude's head, which is metal. Tent spiked skull, that's the thing. And if you read the Devorah account, especially in Hebrew, it is very archaic. And of course, the Miriam story also probably is a memory of some kind of skirmish that occurred in ancient Egypt, where the Israelites were able to escape or at least defeat the Egyptians in that case. So I think what's interesting about this is that these are the literature we have from the ancient Israelites survived are mystical literature. They're accounts of the God speaking, and they're accounts of the God speaking to women in both cases. This may indicate, and again, we only have two pieces of evidence here, this may indicate that women served a unique role in very, very archaic Israelite prophecy. It may have been the case that because they were accepted from battle, that they were allowed to talk to God about, or it may be the case that they had, for whatever reason, thought of as some kind of connection to Yahweh. We just don't know. We have no idea. It just is conspicuous that this earliest pieces of literature are both attested to women. We also have independent prophets, I like to call them freelance prophets. Those are people that basically go around condemning people for everything. Those prophets that you probably know are famous people like Amos, who was famous for condemning the Israelites, specifically their excesses, being very wealthy. Amos is probably the most social justice-y, warrior-y guy of the Hebrew Bible. He really dislikes the fact that the Israelites are so wealthy and they use their wealth to oppress poor people. If you ever read that great section on Yom Kippur, right, where it says, "This is the fast I want. I don't want you fasting from food and water. I don't want you fasting from all kinds of social injustice." That's Amos, right? And so those pieces that are really big. And our tradition, I think, as more progressive people, come from the prophet Amos. So he was an independent social critic. We also know that the Israelite state employed hundreds of prophets. Hundreds. We have at least two different cases where ancient Israelite kings would have hundreds of prophets in their employ, and those hundreds of prophets would go into ecstatic states. They would also, for instance, if the king would be gored by an enemy, it's not uncommon that the prophets would actually have gore, like horns made of iron, and they would dance around with the horns of iron in a very theatrical way, it seems, and that these theatrical shows where prophecy, ecstatic states, and theater really meshed together in ancient Israelite society. So we do know that the Israel, like the ancient Near Assyrian state, employed a number of prophets. It also seems like, by the way, FY, that unlike other ancient Near Eastern peoples, Israelites did not rely on astrology. The ancient Assyrians, ancient Babylonians had developed a very, very sophisticated form of astrology. The ancient Israelites rejected it for reasons that aren't clear. Rejected it not because they better, it wasn't like they somehow knew that it was wrong. It was probably just they didn't have the sophisticated math. But the ancients do not like the idea of astrology. Rather, they like a direct contact with their God. All things told, they all got destroyed by somebody, and none of them saw it coming. We also know that there were Roman prophetic bands. These are sort of prophets that sort of roamed around the countryside. We know they had leaders. Samuel was a leader of such an band of Roman prophets. And we also know that they would roam around and they would play music and they would dance. This is more music were attested in ancient. One of my things I really miss is that we have no idea what any of this music would have sounded like. My idea is that it was always like some great metal or something. But we have no idea what their music sounded like. We have some vague ideas what the instruments were. And we do know that, for instance, the king Saul, the first Israelite king, came in contact with one of these roaming bands of ancient Israelite prophets, and he also immediately fell into an ecstatic state. So it seems like going into ecstatic states was a thing that was, I don't want to say normal, but normalized. It was a thing that could be expected of to happen. So these bands would come through your town, and you might go into an ecstatic state and commune with Yahweh. We do know of several women who were engaged in prophecy, and they had, in some cases, very high rankings in society. One thinks of the prophetess Huldah. Huldah is primarily known from the book of Kings, where the King Josiah, the Judahite King Josiah, finds a tool in a wall, had it written down to justify his political agenda, and which is the Torah we still have, by the way. Like, it basically is a piece of political propaganda from the 6th century BC, which no one talks about that. That's the thing. But Huldah is actually a woman prophet who is an immigrant, a refugee from the north. She's drilled to basically vet whether or not this scroll found in the wall is true. And of course, she does the very wise thing and says that it is. Yeah, I'm sure her neck was on the line. So we do know that women had a relatively high-ranking position of power as prophets. They were not allowed to be priests, but they were allowed to be prophets, and they could do things as high level as basically vet scripture. And again, I want to restate that just so folks hear it. This is a woman getting the legitimacy. That's enormously important in the history of Judaism and in the history of religion more generally, considering how completely excluded women are on almost every level in this historical thing. The ancient Israelites vetted scripture, vetted the Torah almost as we know it, at least the book of Deuteronomy, by a woman. By the woman Huldah. We know virtually nothing about her, but clearly she was considered in contact with Yahweh, and at least for political reasons, did some sections of the Bible as we know them. We also know that there were professional prophets, that is to say, prophets whose job it was to be a prophet. You got paid. I don't know, you got a 9-to-5 job, and you were a prophet. I hope they had a prophet union. I don't know if they did, but local number 95. But they had professional prophets that existed. We also know of non-professional prophets. Sometimes they're called Ish Elohim, men of God. And these were often associated also with miracle working and what may be better described as magic. These would be folks like Elijah and Elisha, who the only accounts of people being resurrected from the dead in the entire Hebrew Bible associated with Elijah and Elisha. And so, on one hand, they represented mostly in divine duels. As you may know, many Israelites and other Canaanite people worshipped a god called Baal, who was very popular as a storm god, because as you may know, storms are very rare in ancient Israel, and you relied on winter rains basically to make sure that you had agricultural crops. And so storms were a godsend, and Baal was very popular. Well, just like on the middle school childhood, people fought each other to show how cool they were, and so did the gods. And so what we know most famously about Elijah was Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a duel and subsequently murdered them all by cutting their heads off when they lost the duel. If that rings of Al-Qaeda or Daesh to you, yes, this is a brutal world, and whether the story happened or not, we don't know, but the fact that the Israelite writer that recorded it relished in it, at least wanted it to happen, whether it really happened or not. So we also have prophetic duels. God can beat up your God kind of situation where they would engage in these prophetic duels, which if you never read that story in the Book of Kings, it's really worth reading. Elijah was a weird, and again, he's on the fringe of society. It's not even clear he's even in life. He's constantly called a Tishbite, right? And so as a Tishbite, he was born Israelite. He's a kind of fringe character that we'll have a very strange relationship with, and we continue to have a strange relationship with him because he didn't die, allegedly, and now we invite him into our homes randomly. So just remember, right, when you invite him into your home, that he did cut off the head, allegedly, of like 500 people one time. In your home, this guy's murdered about 500 people. Elijah. We also know that prophets seem to have been both ecstatic and non-ecstatic, which is to say some of them went into fugue states, we might call them, or ecstatic state to issue their prophecy, others didn't. So we have a range of prophetic techniques. Unfortunately, what we don't have is any accounts in ancient Israeli literature about how they did this. We know they danced and they played music. Nothing else. And yes, I know some of you are probably wondering, did they do drugs? Probably not. At least if they did, it's not recorded. We don't have any attestation of Elijah, mushrooms, and then went to town, or smoked some weed, or whatever, or even drank alcohol. Many of the prophets are actually sworn off of alcohol as part of their prophetic vocation. So we don't have much evidence of substance use in the prophetic literature. However, archaeology is a hell of a drug, and what we recently found a site called Tel Arad, which is one of the few Yahweh shrines to survive from the ancient world. We found on the top of one of the altars where you burned incense, cannabinoids. And so we know that room, right, would have been relatively small. If they were burning incense with cannabinoids in it, they were hotboxing. Maybe. We don't know, right? But we found it. We found evidence of cannabinoids at a Yahweh shrine, one of the only ones that survived. There are only two that survived. There's Tel Arad and there's one at El Don. The Jerusalem one has been destroyed, and so the Shiloh one has never been found. But maybe they were getting contact hives, talking to Yahweh. I don't know. I would encourage you to do your experimentation on your own time, see what works for you. So I do not know. But this, by the way, that find about the Tel Arad cannabinoid thing was just like a year ago. People who think that they don't know everything ever, they find out weird stuff. So Actually, they thought they found it. They just didn't think to test it. That shrine's been sitting in the Israel Museum for like 30 years. They just didn't test it for some reason. And so some guy scraped it and was like, it's weed in here. So that's the thing. The image on the left-hand side here is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is from the Habakkuk Pesher. Pesher is a commentary. This is the first commentary we know of in Judaism. And if you know history of Judaism, commentaries are jams. We are a very writing people. We write things called hyper commentaries, folks. The hyper commentary is a commentary on a commentary on a commentary. That is, commentaries are our jam, and this is the first one. This is a commentary on the prophet Habakkuk. This is recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is the first time where the prophet Habakkuk, is actually being read as a esoteric text. The commentator believes that inside of the prophecy of Habakkuk are secret things in the future. And so if you've ever curious people say that they found secret things in the Bible that are describing the future, this is the first guy or person to do this. Is in the Habakkuk Pesher found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can find this document in any collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But again, what's important to note here, right, is that even the idea that you can mine a prophetic piece of literature to divine the future, an idea that we all know it's culturally very common. Again, you just flip on the radio, and I'm sure you can find some preacher right now telling you that they found something in the Bible, the book of Daniel, whatever. The first time we see it actually in Israelite literature is in this commentary on Habakkuk. So you could read the book of Habakkuk, it's relatively short, and then you could read the Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls and take a look at that one. This is also on display in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. People always flock to see the Great Isaiah Scroll because they think that it's the biggest one, just so you know, if you go look, the Great is a replica. It's not the real one. That one, the real one's stored in a bunker somewhere. But the Habakkuk Pesher is the real one, and no one ever spends any time on it because they just think it's nonsense or they don't care. And I got to spend like an hour looking at it because I'm a complete fanboy of the Habakkuk Pesher. So there we have it. As I mentioned, we know basically nothing about the material culture of the ancient prophets aside from the books that get written down. Clearly, the scribes that wrote these books thought of them as important. We know nothing about their practices, their mystical practices, so we don't know anything about their meditation techniques, their breathing techniques, the drugs they may have used or not used. We know very little about how they achieved these mystical states. So reconstructing what they did is very difficult. We also know very little about the phenomenology of this. And phenomenology is the $2 word that means the experience of this. What it would be a prophet in ancient Israel to experience this ecstatic state. We know very little about it because ancient Israelites, like many ancient cultures, just didn't put as much emphasis on subjectivity that we do. We are a narcissistic people. We love ourselves. We love talking about ourselves, and 1,000 books about talking about memoirs and things, right? Ancient peoples did not care about subjectivity in the way. And so and again, think about this for reading the Hebrew Bible. How often do you learn about the emotional states of characters? Basically never. It's like, and he got angry, or they were sad, and they move on. We know very little about the interiority of these characters because they didn't care about it as a literary motif, right? It's not like Russian romanticism or something. And we know very little about the phenomenology of these experiences. Aside from, they were apparently very, that's it, right? So we know that ancient Israelite prophecy, ancient Israelite mysticism was a social anchor. It was a political anchor. It was an economic anchor. We know that with that many people, 400 prophets employed by a court, this was a part of the economy, right? This was no marginal thing by any stretch of the imagination. But we know very little about it from a material culture. What we do know is that the prophets went away. Israelite prophecy went away eventually. And the reason probably that it went away is that, well, the countries that they served were destroyed. Ancient Israel was destroyed in 722 BCE, and ancient Judah was destroyed in 586. And if your country gets destroyed, well, you don't have a job anymore if you're alive. And we know there are prophets in exile. Ezekiel's one of them. Jeremiah flees into Egypt. So we do know that they escaped, but we know that the social institution of prophecy did not survive these destructions. So why? Well, it could be a lot of things. One of the reasons it could just be that they got killed, right? Just wipe them out. That's the thing that happened to the ancient world. Another reason why it could be the case is, let's see it coming. Your whole job is to communicate from y'all what's about to happen to us and how we can make this not happen. And they didn't, right? So again, if your astrologer doesn't see the thing coming, well, get a different astrologer. So part of the problem of divination is if you don't see the big things coming, like your whole country being destroyed, well, that shakes confidence in your ability to communicate for your God. We also know that prophecies weren't really popular in some ways. I mean, no one likes social critics, right? Go ask the social critics. People hate social critics, right? People hate people being like, listen, you're rich and God hates you for it, and God's going to condemn you and God's going to kill people because of your wealth and your religious abandonment, right? No one like wealthy people, powerful people, don't like to be told that being wealthy and powerful is evil, right? And they're also the people that kill people to prevent them from saying that. And so prophets often got themselves killed for saying these kinds of things. So it could just be that they were also, on some level, in many ways, a marginalized group. As the political situation in ancient Judah gets increasingly bad, what ends up happening is that prophecy ultimately shifts away from condemning the Israelites to basically saying, well, one day God's going to come and kill all of you, right? You're not doing the right thing, and God's going to get God's revenge on you. And this becomes a shift to what sometimes is referred to as the Day of the Lord. When I say Lord, it always makes it like I'm a Southern Baptist preacher. But I can make that "or" really long. The Lord. Anyway, basically what it comes out to is the prophet's more or less saying, God's abandoned you, God's going to kill you all, I'm out. Right? And so there's a kind of prophetic frustration that seems to set in where they're thinking about a more distant removed view, where God will sort things out because the present is just a nightmare. The Babylonians are destroying everything and things like that. And what ends up happening is that after the Judahite state is destroyed in the 6th century BCE, the prophets basically are done for as an institution. The Judahite prophets vanish. And the prophetic literature as we have it in the Hebrew Bible is cut. Now, that doesn't mean that people stop being weird. People continue being weird. Weird is a new kind of weird. And that new kind of weird is apocalypticism. Right? That new kind of weird is apocalypticism. Now, I know that the word apocalyptic typically has to do with the end of the world. That's not what apocalypticism is going to mean in this case. But we'll return next week to talk about apocalypticism. Notice what we haven't talked about much. Angels, demons, the end world, the battle between good and evil, right? The Messiah. We haven't talked about any of that yet. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is the prophets didn't know about any of that stuff. Ancient Israelites didn't really concern themselves with those kinds of things. It's the apocalypse that do. And so when we get back next week, we'll talk about the rise of people who have visions of angels and demons, people who have visions of the afterlife. Israelites really didn't believe in an afterlife. They believed in a place called Sheol, which is just sort of a cave-like grave that you went and stayed in forever. There's no demons living in there, anything like that. So what we're going to see is a massive innovation in Jewish religion in the aftermath of the end of prophecy, where rather than the prophets speaking to God, right, rather than the prophet always speaking to the prophets, what's going to end up happening is a shift from an oral culture, God speaking to the prophets, and this prophet speaking for God. Rather than speaking, God is going to show things to people, right? We're going to switch from a visual culture we're going to switch from an oral culture to a visual culture. And in fact, the word apocalypsis means to reveal. I mean, if you've ever read much in the way of apocalyptic literature, is showing rather than telling, right? Showing rather than, and I saw, blah, 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 blah. So we're going to see it next time with the rise of the apocalyptic, and the apocalyptic is going to bring in the course of a new form of Judaism, and that new form of Judaism is going to be really, really, really weird, with a lot of weird beings and things like that. I will say this, just as we wrap up for tonight: prophetic Judaism did not completely go away. There continued to be prophets from time to time that did speak on behalf. You probably know of one of the more famous ones. His name is Jesus, Josh of Nazareth, as I like to call him. It's probably the case that Jesus of Nazareth, I mean, Jesus is just a Greek version of Joshua, or Josh. He probably thought of himself as speaking on behalf of God. And so these people did emerge, and they did manage to get themselves killed pretty consistently. And what we will also see through the Middle Ages, through the rise of the Middle Ages, is a new form of prophetic Kabbalah, where Abraham will actually develop mystical techniques for getting a vision of God, and we actually have those techniques. They're breathing techniques and meditation techniques, and we'll talk about some of those techniques as we get into the rise of Kabbalah. So prophecy has not completely gone away, but it has a kind of half-life. That as an institution, it passed away, but it has a half-life, and there continue to be prophets from time to time. Judaism, they all continue to have a pretty bad life. Abraham that died. Don't be a prophet. And if you want to make others happy, don't be a prophet. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is.
You're fired. Go fuck yourself.